compete for their own life, which helps the health of your skin. Mechanical barrier, it's a keratinized surface. We'll talk plenty about that. Glycolipid layer, which helps for waterproofing. Biological layer, immune cells. So Langerhans cells are phagocytes, which will, who are residents for the epidermis and who will, a lot, not just defense, but also kind of just clean up and repair. Thousand species of resident bacteria. So also you know about those mites and stuff that are in your eyelashes and all that. That's weird, isn't it? But without them, all would be lost. Body temperature regulation as well. So we are endotherms, or warm, which is to say warm-blooded, maintain a core body temperature, as you know. And so we can shunt blood toward or away from that skin surface. A lot of surface area for cooling or heating, PRN. And so you know that. So we can sweat for evaporative cooling, or our little erector papillae muscles can generate heat via their contraction. Kind of, for us, sort of hairless mammals, doesn't seem as effective, but if you had a woollier coat, I have a very woolly coat, but as if you had a woollier coat, those erector papillae muscles would really create a nice sort of, I don't want to say a buffer, a downy sort of insulation against temperature. So you know that that's important for the function of skin. Sensation, what we know about the world. And it is really fascinating when if you think about how you're able to, we were talking about in vision, how you're able to visually tell texture, you know, just from light and dark, but that we can determine texture with our sensation. We can know that wind is blowing across the skin. And also, obviously heat, cold, pain, but all of those really, think of Braille, reading Braille. Or something like that. Wow, I wonder if there's Braille texting. I wonder if there's a portable device like that. I bet there is. You know that there is Braille communication. But you know, when you think about, wouldn't that be? Oh, I'm sure there's some sort of portable device for. Anyway, that's just something else. So we'll talk about all of these things, but lots of receptors that are mechanoreceptors, really. They're sense pressure, vibration, and stuff like that. Meissner's corpuscles, Merkel discs, Pacinian corpuscles, and that have different levels of what they can feel. So stationed at different depths along the skin, and can habituate or report very quickly, and things like that. So, and then raw nerve endings is a really, very unphysiological way to describe that, but just that there are nerves that just end and in there. And so it 'tis the season, ragweed's coming on. Get ready, people. Get your Flonase, get your ranitidine, whatever you use, if that's your thing. Football season, football, sneezing, if you have that. But anyway, that just nerves themselves without any necessarily a receptor that will send afferent information about what's happening in the skin. Also, vitamin D, you mention this in every dang concentration, really, because it's such a whole thing. But that solar energy at the level of the skin, you get cholesterol conversion to a precursor molecule that then is altered by the liver and kidneys to vitamin D for calcium function. And a blood reservoir, 5% of our blood volume can be there, so this really does a lot to temperature, that we can have blood moved to areas of higher activity. And so part of that is the chills with a fever. The blood is sort of being shunted to higher activity, and skin cools. And so that's all that. Yeah, oh my God. Okay.
I promise I took my allergy medicine.
Okay, then it's worse than an allergy. if you're in an airport, I don't know if I've ever told you this, but you know if you're in an airport, like in another city, and you're looking for the what do you call that, where you walk up and you wait for the plane?
Queue?
Boarding gate, yeah. You know, whatever, your gate number. You know, you don't have to look. You just listen for the sound of coughing. And you go, oh, you guys are going to Oklahoma, aren't you? Chronic cough. Tell me if you don't notice that when you're in some place, you're standing in line somewhere, or you're at the security office or whatever, just a cough. There's just a lot of coughers. We have great allergy medicine here. We also get rid of stuff via the skin, nitrogen-containing wastes and electrolytes and stuff like that through sweat, so excretion. There are all kinds of cells within these layers. So we'll start with epidermis, which is on top of the dermis, so that's outermost. Dermis is innermost. So first, epidermis. Keratinocytes are the cell of the epidermis that are the functional cell that provides for epidermis. This is the outer layer of stratified squamous epithelium. The most low layer is going to be cuboidal, but we'll get to that. So keratinocytes are the most abundant, most important cell producing keratin, which is protein in nature, and it is fibrous. So think collagen for connective tissue and keratin for epidermis. So dermis is going to be more like collagen, and keratin is going to be epidermis. So keratin exists really there. Hair, skin, and nails keratinized. And so keratinization is this formation of really then what we see as the external skin surface, and it's the accumulation of keratin that happens through the life of the cell from innermost to outermost, so that what we're sloughing are completely just really dead cells that are full of keratin. And so we'll look at that process, as you might guess. 4 layers of keratinocytes. That doesn't show the layers here, but the deepest is stratum basal, or the base level. These are cuboidal or columnar cells, and they will give rise to then what become the stratified, or this squamous cell type for the keratinocyte. And they're very much attached, this layer, the basal layer, is very much attached to the layers underneath it. So we know the skin is attached, but we also knew the skin has great movement across the undersurfaces. So it's a tricky attachment in a way, that you have these layers stuck to each other, and yet very mobile over the adipose tissue or the muscle underneath. But this stratum basal will be connected to the basal lamina. Basal lamina is an epithelial product, and it's not the same as basement membrane. Basement membrane is a connective tissue product. Basal lamina, the base of the skin or epidermis itself, will be part of that basement membrane. So there is this basal lamina, which is going to be really a proteinaceous kind of substructure underneath the rest of the epithelial layers. And that stratum basal will be attached to it. And by the connective, the cell connections that we talked about during, I think, histology. So hemidesmosome is going to attach that apical, or that basal surface of that layer to the basal lamina. And then you have desmosomes attaching cell to cell. So it's really important that those cells be quite attached. As these cells mature and keratinize on their way to the outer surface, it will be those cell adhesions or desmosomes that release so that you can have sloughing and exfoliation of skin. So that's cute. You have to have things really tied together. They have to have some mobility and flexibility and stretch, and yet not pull apart until later. And so that's why I really specifically mention those kind of cell adhesions. And so there's a layer of stem cells in there, just like every tissue we've seen. Some will go on to differentiate into the tissue-specific cells, and some will create more progenitor cells, so that you always have this constant supply for replacement and growth, because the skin is always growing and sloughing. Keratinocytes begin to express keratin. Keratin monomers form intermediate filaments. And that's not exactly what I have a picture here of, but just showing you how their structure, you remember their structural, proteins as they build. But an intermediate filament will be a terminology that you see sometimes throughout various levels of kind of physiology or whatever, or microanatomy. And it really just means something that you've seen before, a structure you've kind of seen before, where there are two monomers, I shouldn't say monomer, a polymerized chain of two that wraps in kind of a helix around each other. So remember, like myosin looks like that. Actin was a bit like that. So that's a real common structural theme you have in building components to make something strong. And so keratin in this dimer of two filaments will form what is called an intermediate filament. And that will begin to form. Then those things will aggregate and you'll become something much more fibrous as time goes on or these cells mature. So keratin will be expressed, intermediate filaments will form. The next layer is stratum spinosum, or called the spiny layer, because under microscopy or electron microscopy, it has a spiky kind of appearance, and that's really due to the keratin filaments really beginning to show up. And there are additionally these tonal fibrils, which are another kind of protein filament that helps lock the keratin fibers together, and it really just gives a spiky appearance to the cell. So that's why you get that name. Especially around where desmosomes exist between cells, you really have the tonal fibrils connecting desmosome to internal structure, and it just for some reason has a spiky appearance as an artifact of staining. But you're beginning to have more of a web of the keratin forming. So you're painting the picture that the cells are very active in making keratin, and keratin will begin to fill the cells until the cell really dissipates, and all you almost have left is a keratin net forming this outer surface that will be very strong and sort of indestructible, yet not an armor either. So we're not, think about arthropoda, and you have the exoskeleton, and that armor has to be completely shed, and then the new cuticle grows, and then it tans. There's a lot of crickets right now. Sometimes you see light crickets. They haven't cured their exoskeleton yet. But just think about if that were our strategy, for growth and all of that. So that you have to respect the skin a whole bunch. Respect your skin a whole bunch. If there's a pearl here today, you have to exfoliate, you have to hydrate. Here's a little bit. Because we're exfoliating the outer skin, and we know that exfoliation it really does keep the skin healthy and hydrated, and that's just healthy for not just how the appearance of skin or whatever, but so products, I am a really great target age for products, because you'll spend anything to slather something on that makes you feel better, so that what you have in your head reflects what you see in the mirror. But whatever you put on the skin is just how far does it really go. There's a big push, anything on your skin, you're going to absorb it. Obviously that's true, because we have topical medication. If we didn't absorb things into the skin, we wouldn't do that. But how long is something on the skin, and to what degree? So like if you wash your face, that's not on there very long, versus something that you apply to the skin that can stay there longer. And so the effect those things are going to have. And so that thinking about allergies and stuff like that, how long was that contact, and how big was that response? And that's going to vary from person to person, allergen to allergens. So basal, spinosum, then granulosum, or the granular layer, and that's because the cells look granular. And anytime you know that there's this granular product inside a cell, it means that will be exocytosed or spit or secreted to the outside of that cell. And in this case, these are keratin granules. So the cells will be producing keratin and expressing keratin to the outside world. So it's not enough for the cells to hold keratin within them, that keratin has to be out in the world to create some sort of barrier to the outside, a fibrous barrier on the outside. And so you really see a lot of keratin now has built up to the point that you have granules. So keratohyalin is actually it's a combination of keratin and some other components that will help keratin aggregate once it's secreted. Oh, God, good Lord, people. So, okay, I'll remind you again, you guys have to wash stuff. I'm not saying dirty, and your stuff needs washing. But really, during allergy season, stuff like that, really, you have to wash the hose things off that come into the house. Your dog is bringing so many allergens into your bed, and I would rather sneeze than give up my dog. But just thinking about, removal and exposure to allergens and stuff like that. Wow, that seemed really personal to you. Did it feel personal to you? Oh, yeah. Aw, I just kind of giggled, Diane. Aw, I'm happy. Not like Dark Robin, but laminated granules. Here's another thing that's cool. So, how Schwann cells would wrap around an axonal sheath, forming the sheath, where you end up with really just layers of insulation in the form of cell membrane. You have that being formed from the Golgi body. And so you have all of this lipid being expressed from this cell layer to that outside, and that just waterproofs and waxes all of that keratin mesh. Isn't that just perfect? So how do you get something that's strong and bound together that can resist a lot of abrasion and what we do to skin as part of living, and yet resists drying out and stays supple so that you have a strong barrier that's difficult to breach? And so we use glycolipid for that. Protein and lipid, it's lovely. So anyway, you really begin to have what we think of as the skin at this granulosum layer. The cells are moving from the inside out and changing over time, accumulating keratin and expressing the parts that are really going to form a confluent, flexible, waterproof surface. So it's really more about secretions than it is that cell layer itself. Probably together we can say that that's what happens. Just such a unique thing. And then the stratum corneum, or the horny layer, so keratin, that word, think keratin and kind of corny together. And that is to say something is keratinized, it has a toughness to it, so like a horn. That's kind of where that goes. A nail, a hoof, something like that. And all of those things are really just super intense epidermis, keratinized tissue like this. Outermost layer, 20 to 30 cells thick. The cells they were rich and thick and cuboidal and juicy, and they're becoming drier and drier and have secreted lots of keratin and waxy lipids, and now the cells can actually just die. They can denucleate, the desmosomes will break apart, and those cells can just slough off. And so that renewal layer. Otherwise, you would just be a big callus. You may be a bit calloused emotionally, really, but think ichthyosis, if you've seen, even ketosis pilaris, the bumpy skin, rough and bumpy skin. Those are areas where cells aren't really separating and sloughing well. And so if we didn't do that, you see that skin would just continue to build up and you'd have mounds of dead tissue, really. Or in terms of ichthyosis, you really have this kind of scale-like non-sloughing of tissue. So that sloughing is important. The keratinocyte process from bottom to top is in the neighborhood of a few weeks, a month. And so we're shedding 40,000 cells an hour. A million a day, 8 pounds a year. So, I don't know about you, if you're into dusting, what your thing is, floors or surfaces, I don't know, but I am vacuuming the top of doorways and vacuuming everything, and I'm just thinking skin is up there, it's all organic. And so I now grant you that same privilege of cleaning your house and knowing that it's Oklahoma, so there's a lot of dust, for real, but the reason mites and just everything out there loves to be inside as much as it loves to be outside is because we're just constantly sloughing all this organic material for pests to eat. So if you just dust a little bit. I'm a little bit of a neat freak, but I always think about all those pounds of skin all over the place. So anyway, but sloughing is good, exfoliation is good. There are areas of the epidermis that are known as thick skin, and that's on the palms and the soles. So those surfaces that are going to get the most abuse are thicker, and there would be an additional layer known as stratum lucidum, or the clear layer, and it's just a few cells thick. You see it here. It's underneath the stratum corneum, or that outermost layer, and it represents just a really, see? Now you're allergic to each other. It's just, you girls are so competitive. You guys are competitive, aren't you, though? Just as a person. Do you find yourselves to be competitive people? Yeah. I am. I mean, mainly with myself, but also with others. So I'm in Ravenclaw, as I did the little thing, and I was thinking, well, some of them are kind of nasty competitors, and then I thought, I see. So I'm going to start sneezing and win. But anyway, so for this additional layer is found in epidermis, or in thick skin in the epidermis. And then, so there were keratinocytes, which are making up the bulk of the skin, and follow the process through the layers. Another cell type that will be found in the epidermis are melanocytes, and they're going to secrete melanin for protection of DNA, basically. And the process is absolutely adorable. So these are specialized epidermal cells found in the stratum basale and also associated with hair follicles. We know that we have hair color as to a great degree as a result of melanin secretion. Attached to basal lamina by hemidesmosomes, but not to each other, and they have these cytoplasmic extensions that go up into the layers. It's such a cool cell. Activity of melanocytes is really a kind of ancestral genetic quality. And so here's a great cartoon of one of these little cells. So you have the cell body, it's going to be attached to the basal lamina with its extensions to reach all the layers, really, of the skin. So sun exposure will darken the existing melanin, so there's a bit of a curing process with melanin. Also will increase production of melanin. And so melanocytes can tell each other and kind of signal each other to produce melanin. And so you have this aggregation of the structural proteins accumulate in melanosomes, or just some sort of granule or vesicle full of melanin. And then these melanosomes are transported into these cytoplasmic fingers. And then the keratinocytes will actually phagocytize the melanin from the melanocytes, and it will be internalized and kind of placed as an umbrella over the nucleus. Is that a touching process to you? It really is to me. I mean, these cells are just here, telling you you're going to need an umbrella, take your coat, it's cold out there, and then this melanin can shield the DNA from UV destruction. So, what came first? Not us. The sun and everything else. I mean, it just geologically, creatively, it just makes so much sense that we're based on the sun and solar energy and glucose and all the things that depend on it. And so, it's exciting. Ultraviolet radiation to protect DNA, so melanin. And it's just, you know, if you were from someplace, I was so disappointed. I did that ancestry thing, and 96% of my DNA is from the UK. And the other 4% was like Ireland. So, not far. You know, and I was wanting something a little toastier in there, you know, a little more exciting in there. So sun exposure and how the faces are shaped and the skin is colored is really about, you know, genetically protecting yourself from the environment. I was from a cooler environment, so I grew hair, you know, so I mean, we really genetically can see that. And then interestingly, when we all reproduce, then we have a melange of all the best stuff there is out there, you know. So, except for my people, they were all just breeding in the UK. So, I mean, I intensely wanted something intriguing in there, like, I don't know, just a little something Middle Eastern, something African in there. Not so much. But anyway. Epidermis, there are keratinocytes, there are melanocytes, and Langerhans cells. These are monocyte-derived cells. So these are cells coming from the bone marrow or blood cells that will take up permanent residence in the epidermis. And they are phagocytes, which is to say they will eat stuff, large particles. And so they will be, if something foreign is on the scene, they will take a picture of that, deliver it to the centers, the lymph nodes, expose that to lymph cells, and so defense operatives can then go to that site and begin to amp up the process for defense. So immune defense and surveillance. So here you go with a picture of all of those layers. So you have, is this really showing? Oh, here's all the cells. This is a good cartoon. So the little melanocyte with all of its cytoplasmic extensions, so that you see all the cells can have direct contact with one of those cells, more or less, and take what it needs. You have this dermis. So stratum basal, spinosum, granulosum. The lucidum would only be available on the thick epidermis, and then the stratum corneum. So the spinosum is really the thick layer where you're having a tremendous production period for what is going to need to come next. Such that those outermost stratum corneum cells begin to become loose from each other and flake off. So really what we're seeing is just a layer of dead cells. And so we have made judgments as societies for the eons over something that's not even alive. That just sounds so dumb, doesn't it? And in fact, it really is. So, let's go deeper. The dermis will be the connective tissue layer. So do you remember the cell types in histology? There was epidermis tissue type, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nerve tissue. And so for all of your sections, just know all of those things are there. And so we're just going through those. So epidermis was epithelial tissue type, and now sitting underneath that is the connective tissue. So what's true about connective tissue is few cells, lots of matrix. And that matrix is going to be full of protein, really, and however much fluid or gel material that will be around there. So the dermis, underneath the epidermis, will be divided into two layers, and we'll look at that. So that cells plus matrix, semi-fluid, extracellular fluid is embedded with fibers. And this is where, you know, in the epidermis, I didn't mention any vascular layer or nervous tissue. There isn't. Everything is in the dermis. So your skin and all of that growth and all those cells are supplied from vascular vasculature that is rich in the dermis. So that's interesting. We know that the skin is pretty thin, really, overall, and you're able to really note changes underneath very topically. That there is all of the nervous tissue and all of the vascular tissue will be located in the dermis only. And so everything has to just be absorbed into the epidermis from that. And then that goes to how you look at burns and how you look at the depth of tissue damage and so forth. And when you get past that epidermal layer and you're into the dermis or below, where you have a variety of pain will be associated here. You go lower than that, you kind of lose that a bit. And so you'll see that in terms of your reactivity when you're looking at patients. So rich with nerve fibers, the blood and lymphatics, the vasculature is there. There are these dermal papillae, which is plural, which are these folds within the dermis, these big kind of waves that you see. A papilla would be some sort of finger-like projection. And so that these two layers can kind of nest into each other, kind of egg crate into each other, so that you have some attachment, or a little better attachment. So these layers aren't just laying flat on each other, they're kind of interdigitated a bit. Oh, God, do you ever get to use the word interdigitate? I do. Jealous? Jealous much? Oh, and I used it there, too. Same song, different verse. So we'll look at the two dermal layers. First, the papillary layer, which is going to be closest to that basal lamina, or that stratum basal. It's thinner than the other. It includes the dermal papilla. So it's this papillary layer where you see the dermal papilla, well named. There are fibroblasts. So of connective tissue cells, that were pretty specific to each cell. So like bone is connective tissue, and those cells were osteocytes. And there are fibroblasts and more traditional cartilage and other kinds of connective tissue. So they will be producing, like fibroblasts make fibers, and they're making largely collagen-type fibers, largely. And collagen fibers come in several different types. And I have listed some of the types here and there. I don't really care about that number, but you do tend to, if you read something about collagen, they'll often put that type in there. And it's just specific to tissue. It's not really a big deal, but I kind of hated to leave it off. And so you have lots of collagen there. You also have mast cells in both the skin and mucous membranes. But these will be connective tissue phagocytes that are granular in nature, which just means they're grainy. So when you study cell types, you guys did blood. Oh. Thalassemia. I'm just going to throw that word out there and piss you off. So you had your blood, you have the lymphoid and myeloid kind of branches of blood cells, and within them, some of them are granulocytes and some of them are agranulocytes. Granulocytes are granular and they secrete lots of stuff, and agranulocytes have a smooth cytoplasm and act a little bit differently. So you see here the lymphoid cell line makes lymphoid cells. The myeloid cell line will be making all these other kind of cells that are blood cells. So these are blood in nature. And so just to remind you what some of them are, there is the cell that will become all of the platelets. So blood cells are in 3 flavors. Just to remind you, there are red ones, white ones, and then there are the platelets. So that's blood cells. So a mast cell is a kind of blood cell that isn't circulating in blood, it's living permanently in tissue. And here's some of the flavors of some of these things. They're basophils, neutrophils, eosinophils, and macrophages, and then you have lymphocytes over on the other side. And I only put that up there because I don't think it's fair for me to say granulocyte or phagocyte or something like that without kind of telling you, okay, remember the story of how they got there. Although we haven't specifically covered that, and we will later in infectious diseases, but anyway. So those are all basically phagocytes, all those cells that get produced that are white cells. And they're immune in function, they're defensive in function, and specifically mast cells will be residents of skin in the dermal layer, specifically the papillary layer, and then also in mucous membranes. And they have granulocytes, and when they become activated, they degranulate or secrete all their stuff, and some of the stuff they secrete, for one thing, is histamine. That's why you take antihistamines, because histamines do all kinds of great inflammatory reactive things, like create edema, create blood flow, increased blood flow. Well, that turns out like congestion, or it turns out like diarrhea, maybe, or something like that, depending on where that tissue is, how that inflammatory process works. But it's a positive process that can run amok. Do I now say amok, amok, amok?
Yes.
Why do we love that movie? That movie is so old now. Hocus Pocus. It's like 20 years old or something, isn't it?
Me too.
That what?
I said I probably haven't seen it since it came out.
That's one of those we watched every year, you know, like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and watched Hocus Pocus.
I think ABC Family does like one whole day of it, I think, or they used to, like, back to back for like 24 hours.
Well, it is
I
really
think.
funny. The witches, does anyone just not know Hocus Pocus? I mean, it's just,
It's a good one.
I'm pretty sure it's on every day for the 31 days of fall.
Every single day.
why is it funny? I mean, I don't know, I just like witches, I guess, but, and then there's Sarah Jessica Parker, so.
Yeah, before she got really famous.
Yeah. Yeah. So mast cell degranulation is an anti-inflammatory process that can run amok. See, circle back. And then there are dendritic cells, which are also monocytes. They come from the blood tissue, or they're blood-generating cells that will take up residence. And it's a specific kind of phagocyte that will be found in skin, the respiratory tract, and the GI tract. So RT is respiratory tract, and then GT, gastrointestinal tract. They work as antigen-presenting cells. So I put APC there. Then don't freak out. This is just one of those things, if you know what that means, fine, and if you don't, fine. But the truth is that anything that phagocytizes something foreign, or even something non-foreign, something self, can present that, bits of that, to immune system cells or to other cells and stimulate their response if they too recognize that. Like, have you seen this guy? Do you know this guy? And then respond. And it's a special operation that can go suss out that antigen. So antigen presentation is a function of the immune cells, white blood cells, that are able to stimulate an inflammatory defensive response. And so mast cells are for that purpose in terms of creating a localized response, sitting there and degranulating and creating inflammation, which will help fight some sort of breach of the barrier. Really important, the skin has to be a consistent barrier once it's breached, and because we're subject to skin and all that implies, things, it can breach it, there will be abrasions and this and that, and so you have to have some sort of defense on site. And then you have cells like dendritic cells, Langerhans cells, that can then go and help alert the system to what may be going on locally. And so that's part of the whole immune defense. Also, why you have a dermatology specialty at all, because the skin is so reactive to things. And you're going to find that from the outside there are reactions, and there are reactions from the inside because of this dovetail between the immune system and the outside world. So collagen fibers, specifically type 7, don't really care, insert to the basal lamina and bind the dermis to the epidermis, so that you actually do have fibrous connections between not just these dermal sort of finger-like projections, but then a connection between the two layers like you would expect there to be a Velcro situation. Well, you don't really want it to come apart, but it can. I guess I should note that dermal ridges are the dermal papillae that really show up like as fingerprints or lines in the skin. And so, so collagen, just a little briefy thing here, just to say there are all of these subtypes. I don't care that you know the numbers of these. I don't really think it's so important, although there's probably some drug that's specific to certain numbers, and you may hear about some of those things. Just the fact that there are types of collagen, it's all collagen, but the way they kind of arrange the fibers will be specific to the skin area, or the area, so skin. Type 1, skin, tendon, organs, bone, very abundant. Type 2, cartilage. 3 is part of the reticular fibers, often part of, along with type 1. Type 4, the basal lamina, and that's kind of interesting. So that's an epithelial product, not a connective tissue product. And then 5, cell surface here at the center. Okay, that was very very. And so you see how collagen fibers form these. We keep seeing these helical kind of combinations. It really forms a lot of strength, and it is something that would be flexible and strong. So, you know, like cable bridges, you know, you have to have a lot of strength, and you also have to have flexibility so that the rhythm and cadence of mechanics across that bridge can work. So, it's just lovely. Deep to the papillary layer is the second layer of the dermis. So you have the papillary layer of the dermis, lots of collagen there, and then you have the reticular layer, and it really is just more connective tissue, but it looks different. It's much more kind of disorganized looking in a lot of ways, and you absolutely can see it on this picture. This reticular layer looks reticulated or web-like, because it's going to have a whole bunch of collagen fibers and a lot of elastic fibers. Elastic fibers are going to be protein fibers that just have a little bit more of an ability to stretch and contract. And that's a great spring-like function to have amidst all of these collagen fibers. So you can really see that appearance of that reticular layer underneath that papillary layer, and how much more dense that papillary layer looks. Dermis, 2 layers, the papillary layer, the reticular layer. And so this picture above shows both, this is just a great picture, both collagen fibers, which are, they're sturdy, more linear, and then elastic fibers, which are boingier, springier, wavier looking. But all that together, you certainly get that reticular layer. That just makes sense. If you were going to design skin, you'd want both of those in there. You'd pick that off the table. So, you know, I really don't talk about pathophysiology or anything like that, but I do think it helps to demonstrate, by looking at these things, the layers. So a blister, that's a heel there. It's a common blister in women because, you know, we're wearing a far more variety of shoes than I think men do. But, you know, you get a blister. You're a runner and you get blisters. You lose nails saying. Yeah. So anyway, a blister then, if you have chronic rubbing and friction, that's not chronic enough to have formed to thicken the skin like a callus, but something more acute, the dermis can separate from the epidermis. And when those 2 layers aren't connected, then you have this separation and fluid can fill in there. And that's what that is. So that top layer of the blister, you're really just seeing what epidermis is. So that's kind of a great way to envision that. And then these striations or stretch marks, that would be a gravid female torso with stretch marks. A lot of that is genetic. Not everyone will stretch mark or form those stria, but that is a separation when you have had excessive acute stretching. And here we think certainly from the inside, so not from the outside so much. But this will be separation of the connective tissue itself. So not between layers, but more of this kind of separation within the connective tissue so that you see the ridges or the lines of separation. And so to what degree a person will, their connective tissue would naturally separate and do this upon stretching. And this isn't certainly the only, it's any place that the skin has been placed under stretch beyond its elastic strength can do this. And so the degree to which that person does that or can heal from that will be how much residual kind of scarring that you see as a result of that. And so it's just skin, and you can, this is one of these things that has no medical consequence really, but it has a lot of psychological consequence, as all skin things do. You know the movie Mean Girls? Tina Fey wrote that from a book called Queen Bees and Wannabes, and it was a book about kind of the social culture of females, kind of pubescent females. But it really applies to males as well, and just the social structure that applies. But I read that book, and I remember in it that the author described being in like middle school as there's a boat, and either you're in the boat or you're out of the boat. And there are all kinds of things, and certainly it's about that the culture of wherever that person lives. But some things are pretty universal. You really have to look like everybody else just to be in the boat. And the things that kick you out of the boat are just physical differences, or maybe you don't line up this idea of what is male or female. You know, there are changes amongst the world this way. But those are the things that keep you out of the boat. But she specifically said acne keeps you out of the boat. And so, and then you just struggle to get back in. And this is one of these reasons these social alliances form, is how can I get back in? You know, if you have something that would otherwise keep you out. So it's really quite fascinating. But skin becomes one of those huge social influencers. And so don't underestimate those kind of things. So when you have patients, by the time somebody has a pregnancy or they've had a great weight gain and loss and have stretch marks or wherever they may have them, address it, I think. You know, I don't think kids are going to go, I'm really feeling uncomfortable about my acne. Now, a lot of, you know, that's certainly very generational. A lot of the young kids will probably be talking more like that. But just go, you know, how are you feeling about your skin? What do we need to do about that? Or, you know, just bring it up, I think, when you do have adolescents and deal with it. Maybe give them entree for acceptance of those kind of things. So anyway, big deal in dermatology. People are always going to show you some little pissant thing on their skin, you know. Sometimes they aren't so pissant. They become, you know, cancers and all kinds of things. But you can read a lot about health from the skin for sure. So how do we get blood in there in the dermis? This is a great picture. Oh, you want a little breaky break? Yeah. All right, make your potties. I'll see you.